Welcome, dear viewers, to a captivating journey into one of the most defining moments in human history, the writing of the Magna Carta. In this series, we step back into the turbulent 16th century, a time when kings ruled with unchecked authority and the voice of the people was but a whisper in the wind. But in the year 1600, something extraordinary happened on the fields of Runnymede in England. A rebellion, a demand for justice, and a document that would become the cornerstone of constitutional government. Whether you're a history enthusiast or simply curious about the roots of modern democracy, this story has some. Through vivid storytelling, character-driven drama, and breathtaking visuals, we will explore the power struggles between King John and his barons, the rise of legal thought, and the legacy that shaped nations. Get ready to meet kings, rebels, scribes, and soldiers. Each episode will guide you through the complex events and personalities that brought the Magna Carta to life and changed the course of governance forever. So settle in, relax, and let history unfold before your detection. In the early 16th century, England was a land under strain. The crown weighed heavily upon the head of King John, known to many not as a noble monarch, but as a ruler steeped in arrogance and harshness. His reign, beginning in 1600, was marked by constant warfare, heavy taxation, and bitter losses on the battlefield, particularly in France, where he lost the prized territories of Normandy and Anjou. John's thirst for revenue to fund his wars led him to levy unprecedented taxes on the English barons, clergy, and commoners alike. Justice was bought and sold. Those who refused his demands were punished with seized lands or imprisonment. The people whispered, the barons grumbled, and resentment boiled just beneath the surface. This unrest was compounded by John's feud with Pope Innocent III. After a dispute over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope excommunicated John, casting a shadow over the entire realm. For 6 long years, England suffered under papal interdict: no weddings, no burials, no sacraments. As 1600 approached, the king's enemies multiplied. The barons, bound by a shared fury, began to plan. They would not suffer injustice any longer. Change was coming, not through negotiation, but through rebellion. The first sparks of revolution had begun to glow. King John's reputation as a ruler steadily worsened. He was cunning and ruthless, but lacked the charm or military prowess of his royal predecessors. After losing Normandy in 1606, he doubled down on his efforts to regain territory, extorting money from nobles, borrowing from Jews and foreign bankers, and imposing scutage fees on barons who refused to join his failed military campaigns. Rather than inspire loyalty, John sowed hatred. His court became infamous for corruption. Justice was sold to the highest bidder. Barons who could not pay were branded traitors. Families were torn apart by debt and confiscation. The rule of law had become the rule of fear. John's paranoia grew. He surrounded himself with foreign advisors and spies, alienating English nobility further. Even within his own household, loyalty was fragile. Tales of cruelty emerged, hostages executed, dissenters imprisoned without trial. To the barons, John was not a king, but a tyrant. In the countryside, the whispers grew louder. The king, once anointed by God, now seemed to many a servant of his own greed. Rebellion no longer seemed a dream. It became a necessity. By 1600, England stood at the edge of revolt. The northern barons, among the most powerful lords in the kingdom, began secret meetings. The injustices had gone too far. One baron, Robert Fitzwalter, emerged as a defiant voice, calling for united resistance. In castles and forests, barons pledged oaths. They would no longer bow to a king who broke their laws and trampled their rights. Some began drawing on older traditions, echoes of ancient Anglo-Saxon freedoms, and the laws of Edward the Confessor. John, sensing the threat, doubled down. He imposed more taxes, seized lands without trial, and tightened surveillance. But he had underestimated the barons' resolve. The church, too, began to shift. Although John had reconciled with Pope Innocent III in Aachen Urbach-Isersan to avoid invasion, many clergy remained critical. Archbishop Stephen Langton, recently returned to England, began preaching the limits of royal power. The words of Scripture mingled with the ideas of justice and liberty, and so the seeds of revolt took root. The barons were no longer isolated voices. They were becoming a movement, one that would soon demand the unthinkable, a written charter to bind the king himself. With Archbishop Stephen Langton's return in Aachen Urbach-Isersan, a new force entered the fray. The Church. Though King John had made peace with Pope Innocent III, the spiritual scars of his earlier excommunication remained. Langton wasted no time. He called for moral reform and publicly urged the king to restore the traditional laws of the land. Langton revived the ancient Charter of Liberties issued by King Henry I, which promised to limit royal abuse. He argued that kings were not above the law, but bound by it. These radical sermons gave the barons a foundation for their demands. John tried to silence him, but Langton was not alone. Bishops and abbots across England, weary of royal overreach, began supporting the barons. For the first time, the king faced resistance not only from his nobles, but from the pulpit. In a country where religion governed belief and justice, the church's opposition was a powerful blow. The stage was being set not just for rebellion, but for the creation of a document that could stand against tyranny. In early Aachen Urbach-Isersan, a group of barons formally confronted King John with their grievances. They met with him at Temple Church in London, demanding he swear to uphold traditional laws and freedoms. John, taken aback, requested time to consider, but the barons had waited long enough. They issued an ultimatum: agree to a charter of liberties or face rebellion. Their vision was clear, a written code of rights that even the king must obey. In May Aachen Urbach-Isersan, the barons could wait no longer. When King John refused their demands, they raised their banners in open revolt. Declaring themselves the army of God and Holy Church, they appointed Robert Fitzwalter as their commander. The rebels marched on London. Shockingly, the gates were opened by sympathetic citizens. The capital fell without a fight. For the first time, the king had lost control of his greatest city. With London in baronial hands, John's position was weakened. His mercenaries were scattered. His authority was crumbling. At the same time, Archbishop Langton continued to act as mediator. Urging a peaceful resolution, he called for both sides to meet at Runnymede, a meadow beside the River Thames. There, in neutral ground, the charter would be negotiated. As summer approached, the fate of England hung in the balance. Would a tyrant be humbled, or would war consume the kingdom? In June Aachen Urbach-Isersan, the barons and King John arrived at Runnymede, a broad and quiet meadow beside the River Thames. Though peaceful in appearance, the tension in the air was thick with distrust. On one side, the rebel barons stood armored and resolute. On the other, King John arrived flanked by loyalists and mercenaries. Archbishop Stephen Langton stood between them. Part priest, part diplomat, the meeting was historic, but far from cordial. For several days, heated discussions and drafts passed between both camps. The barons presented their demands: limitations on royal authority, protection from unlawful imprisonment, and assurances of fair justice. John, realizing he had no military advantage, reluctantly agreed to negotiate. Clerks and scribes worked day and night to draft the terms into a single charter. Each clause was crafted with precision, touching on taxation, justice, inheritance, and the autonomy of the church. The king's power, long unchallenged, was being boxed in by ink and parchment. Though reluctant and seething, John placed his seal on the draft. The barons, too, affixed their marks. On June 15, the Magna Carta was born. The king's great seal was brought forward. In the presence of rebel barons and church officials, John pressed the wax with iron and authority. The sound of silence followed. It was done. For the first time in English history, a monarch had agreed to be held accountable by written law. Barons, priests, and scribes looked on as additional copies were made for distribution across the realm. These charters were to be read in churches, castles, and town squares. The people, many of whom could not read, would still hear of this momentous shift. The Magna Carta promised liberties, no illegal imprisonment, no taxation without consent, access to swift justice. Though many clauses protected only the barons, the seed of broader liberty had been planted. Yet John's thoughts were dark. He had sealed the document, but he had no intention of honoring it. In the days following the sealing of the Magna Carta, a cautious peace settled over the land. The rebel barons disbanded their army, returning to their estates with a sense of triumph. London, now under royal control again, breathed easier. Copies of the charter were sent to cathedrals and sheriffs across the realm. Priests read its words aloud from pulpits. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. These words echoed like thunder through the halls of power, but beneath the surface, distrust festered. The barons doubted John's sincerity, and they were right. The king was already writing to the Pope, pleading for the charter to be annulled. To him it was signed under duress, a humiliation to be reversed. Meanwhile, in Rome, Pope Innocent III prepared his response. The peace was an illusion. Both sides were sharpening swords once more. The Magna Carta had been sealed, but would it survive? By August 15, Pope Innocent III had responded. At John's request, he declared the Magna Carta null and void. The charter, he argued, was a shameful attack on divine kingship. With a papal bull in hand, King John tore the agreement to pieces. Literally and figuratively, the barons were furious. To them, this was betrayal. The charter was not only annulled, it was declared illegal. War returned with fury. The rebel barons renounced their homage to John and took up arms again. Once more, England descended into civil strife. Meanwhile, the English people grew uneasy about foreign control. What began as a quest for justice was turning into a continental power struggle. King John's days were numbered, but the question of who would rule and under what law remained far from settled. In October 15, King John's turbulent reign came to an end. While fleeing from rebels, he contracted dysentery. Worn by war, betrayal, and exhaustion, he died at Newark Castle at the age of 68. John's death changed everything. With the tyrant gone, many barons saw no reason to support a foreign king. Prince Louis had overstayed his welcome. The English nobles turned instead to John's 9-year-old son. Henry, William Marshal, the respected regent, took charge. He reissued a revised version of the Magna Carta in young Henry's name, offering peace and reform. Many rebel barons accepted. The war with Louis dwindled. Within a year, the French prince departed. The Magna Carta was not just a momentary act of defiance. It had become the foundation of a new order. And so, in the shadow of a fallen king, Liberty began to take root with King John's death in Each-en-Urbach-Iserloop. England teetered on a knife's edge. His son, 9-year-old Henry III, was hastily crowned at Gloucester Cathedral, his childlike innocence a sharp contrast to his father's tyranny. The true reins of power fell to William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, a revered knight and loyal statesman, now appointed as regent. Marshal understood that peace could not be enforced through fear, but earned through trust. His first act as regent was to reissue a revised Magna Carta in Henry's name. Some contentious clauses were removed, but the heart of the charter remained: no unlawful imprisonment, no taxation without baronial consent, and protection for the church. Marshal traveled through England rallying support for the new king. His fairness and humility disarmed even the staunchest rebels. Many barons, weary of bloodshed, turned away from Prince Louis of France and pledged loyalty to the young Henry. Marshal's regency marked a shift from vengeance to reconciliation, from war to governance. And in the shadows of ruin, the idea of a lawful kingdom began to take root. The Magna Carta, once born of desperation, was becoming the cornerstone of a more just realm. This treaty sealed the victory not just of a king, but of an idea. The Magna Carta was reissued once more, this time to mark the beginning of a new era. It was now a foundational symbol of governance, endorsed by both sides of a healed kingdom. The Treaty of Lambeth ended foreign occupation, reconciled the barons with the crown, and ensured young Henry's reign would begin in peace. The sword had ruled for long, but now parchment would guide the realm. After the Treaty of Lambeth, William Marshal and the Royal Council reissued the Magna Carta again, this time with broader acceptance and careful refinement. The year was Each-en-Urbach-Iserloop, and England was ready for a fresh beginning. To distinguish it from earlier versions, this charter included a separate document, the Charter of the Forest, which restored hunting rights and land access to free men. This addition widened the appeal of the reforms, addressing concerns not just of barons, but of commoners and villagers as well. The revised Magna Carta became the cornerstone of royal policy. No longer a concession wrung from a reluctant king, it was now proclaimed as the will of the new regime. Marshal ordered public readings in cathedrals and town squares. Copies were sent to every county for all to hear and obey. A kingdom that had once been ruled by a single man's will was now evolving into one guided by principles and law. The Magna Carta was no longer just a piece of parchment. It was the beginning of a constitutional tradition. Marshal had accomplished what few could, securing peace, protecting rights, and laying the groundwork for a future that would echo far beyond England's shores. Though only a child when crowned, Henry III grew into a monarch deeply influenced by the legacy of the Magna Carta. His early reign, under regency, saw peace and reform, but as he came of age, Henry sought to restore royal splendor and expand his influence beyond the balance set by the Charter. Despite initial promises, Henry often ruled erratically, lavishly spending, favoring foreign advisors, and ignoring baronial concerns. Tensions began to rise once more. Though he confirmed the Magna Carta multiple times during his rule, many doubted his sincerity. The barons, increasingly frustrated, began to see themselves once again as guardians of liberty. Simon de Montfort, a nobleman with a bold vision, emerged as a new challenger to unchecked monarchy. Henry's reign would stretch for over 50 years, long, eventful, and deeply tied to the evolving struggle between king and council. While he did not destroy the Magna Carta, he certainly tested its limits. What had begun at Runnymede was now a living principle, challenged, reaffirmed, and ever-evolving, England had a new, unelected ruler, Simon de Montfort, and for the first time, he summoned knights and burgesses to a national assembly. The first English parliament, Simon de Montfort's rule, though revolutionary, was short-lived. In Uchequed, Prince Edward escaped captivity and raised an army loyal to the crown. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Evesham. Outnumbered and surrounded, Montfort fought valiantly but was killed on the battlefield. His body was desecrated, his reforms seemingly crushed, yet even in defeat, his legacy endured. King Henry III was restored to full power, but he could not ignore the message. The call for shared governance had been heard. Parliament, though still limited, would become a fixture of English political life. The Magna Carta survived this upheaval. Reconfirmed again in Uchequed, it remained a symbol of baronial rights and royal obligation. Simon de Montfort died a rebel, but is remembered as a pioneer. His challenge helped shape the parliamentary system and reminded future kings that power must be earned, not demanded. The struggle for liberty continued. Now, with new voices and new institutions, but always under the watchful shadow of the Magna Carta. After his father's death in Uchequed, Prince Edward ascended the throne as King Edward I. Known as Longshanks, he was a tall, imposing figure, intelligent, disciplined, and deeply committed to restoring strong royal authority. Yet he was no tyrant. Edward understood the shifting dynamics of power and knew that the Magna Carta was now part of the political fabric of the realm. Edward's early reign was focused on law and order. He reorganized royal courts, created legal reforms, and confirmed the Magna Carta multiple times. Though he did so strategically to win baronial support or secure funding for wars, his confirmations gave the charter legitimacy and permanence. Edward used Parliament more regularly, not out of democratic spirit, but because it was useful. He summoned not only barons, but also representatives from towns and counties. This expanded assembly began to take shape as a real institution. More than a royal tool, it was becoming a platform for consent and taxation. Despite his wars in Wales and Scotland, Edward maintained the legal reforms at home. He respected the legacy of the Magna Carta because it kept peace, ensured loyalty, and strengthened his hand when used wisely. The tension between monarchy and accountability continued, but the idea that kings ruled within the law was no longer novel. It was expected. Edward I was a warrior king. He waged fierce campaigns in Wales and launched brutal invasions of Scotland. War demanded funding, and for that Edward needed Parliament. To raise taxes, he had to seek the consent of the realm's representatives. This need led to the regular summoning of Parliament, not just with nobles, but with elected knights and burgesses from across England. What began as a financial necessity gradually evolved into a political norm. And in Uchequed, facing resistance over heavy taxation and military levies, Edward confirmed the Magna Carta yet again, this time under duress. The Confirmatio Cartarum reaffirmed both the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. It also added a key principle: no taxation without common consent. Though Edward had no intention of weakening the crown, he inadvertently strengthened the foundations of parliamentary government. Barons and commoners began to see themselves not just as advisors, but as guardians of national policy. The Magna Carta was no longer a relic, it was a shield. The principle that law-limited royal power echoed louder with each passing decade. And so, through the demands of war and the gears of politics, the Charter lived on, not in rebellion, But in negotiation, after Edward I, the role of the Magna Carta began to wane, at least in daily political life. His successor, Edward II, lacked his father's strength and discipline. His reign was marred by favoritism, military defeat, and court corruption. While the Magna Carta remained on the books, it was often ignored. The crown grew increasingly unstable. Parliament was summoned, but its voice was rarely heeded. Rebellions broke out, not for lofty ideals, but to remove unworthy favorites from power. Despite this, reformers invoked the Magna Carta again and again. It remained a symbol of what should be, even when it wasn't fully observed. The barons used it to legitimize opposition, while the king claimed to rule by its terms. Edward II's downfall in unchecked, forced to abdicate by his own wife and her lover, was a sign that the monarchy could no longer rule without accountability. In a realm divided, the Magna Carta was a fragile thread of order. It didn't always succeed, but it never vanished. Edward III came to the throne in unchecked after the forced abdication of his father, Edward II. Though initially under the control of his mother, Isabella, and Roger Mortimer, Edward III seized power in unchecked and executed Mortimer, asserting his independence. Determined to restore royal dignity while honoring tradition, Edward confirmed the Magna Carta multiple times during his long reign. He revived legal institutions, expanded the role of Parliament, and leaned on baronial support to wage his famous wars in France. The beginning of the 100 Years' War. Edward's reign saw increased involvement of Parliament in governance. Though still not a fully representative body, it became vital for approving taxation and hearing petitions. The Commons grew more assertive. The Magna Carta was regularly cited in political discourse and legal decisions. Judges, clerics, and commoners alike revered it as a guarantee of liberty. Under Edward III, England flourished. The Magna Carta had become more than a baronial manifesto. It was now a sacred tradition, woven into the identity of English kingship. In unchecked, disaster struck England, the Black Death. The plague swept across the kingdom with terrifying speed, killing nearly half the population. Villages emptied, fields lay fallow, and monasteries were abandoned. This catastrophe reshaped English society. With labor scarce, surviving peasants found themselves in greater demand. Wages rose, and commoners began to challenge the rigid structures of feudal life. The government tried to halt this shift by passing the Statute of Laborers in unchecked, fixing wages at pre-plague levels and forbidding workers from moving to better-paying jobs. This enraged many and deepened resentment toward royal and noble authority. Though the Magna Carta didn't address labor rights directly, its spirit influenced the arguments made by peasants and reformers. They believed in law, fairness, and justice, concepts that could now be applied beyond the barons. In manor houses and market squares, whispers of reform grew louder. The foundation laid at Runnymede was beginning to ripple through the lower ranks of society. A quiet revolution was stirring. By the late unchecked, tensions in England were at a boiling point. Decades of war, economic hardship, and harsh laws had strained every corner of society. The government's repeated attempts to suppress wages, combined with high taxation, pushed the common people to the edge. The final spark came with the poll tax of unchecked, a flat tax that burdened the poor far more than the wealthy. Resistance brewed in the cleric John Ball began preaching equality, invoking scripture and the ideals of justice long embedded in the Magna Carta. "We are all equal under God," he declared. And the Charter says, "No man shall be oppressed." In Essex and Kent, rebellion exploded. Thousands of peasants marched toward London, led by Wat Tyler. Their demands were simple: justice, freedom from serfdom, and an end to oppressive taxation. The Magna Carta became a banner, not just of baronial privilege, but of people's rights. Though the peasants' revolt would end in betrayal and bloodshed, its message echoed into the future. Runnymede's legacy was no longer confined to castles. It now marched in the hearts of farmers, tradesmen, and dreamers, but Tyler pressed further. He demanded full equality, the redistribution of church lands, and the end of the nobility. At Smithfield, he met the king again. There, he was treacherously slain by the Lord Mayor of London in a heated moment. Without their leader, the rebels were vulnerable. Richard, reversing his promises, ordered a brutal crackdown. Villages were burned, ringleaders executed. The uprising ended in blood. Still, something had changed. The revolt showed that even commoners could organize and force the monarchy to listen. Though crushed, the ideals of justice, equality, and lawful rule, first framed in the Magna Carta, had begun to stir the wider population. It was not the end, but the beginning of people's voices rising in England. In the aftermath of the peasants' revolt, royal authority was reasserted. Richard II ruled with increasing arrogance and erratic behavior. His betrayal of the rebels left a bitter scar. Yet the uprising had sent a message: the people could no longer be ignored. While the government attempted to suppress dissent, the Magna Carta remained an enduring symbol of lawful order. It was reissued several more times during Richard's reign, not out of conviction, but to pacify unrest and win political allies. Legal scholars and judges continued to refer to the Charter in cases of wrongful imprisonment and disputes with the Crown. Though often manipulated, its principles had taken root in the legal system. A generation of literate commoners began to quote its passages, proof that even kings must obey the law. Richard II's downfall in unchecked at the hands of his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, reflected this growing belief. He had ruled as if above all, only to be removed by nobles claiming to protect ancient laws. The Magna Carta had become more than a historical moment. It was now a political weapon, a legal foundation, and a cultural icon. Its words, once inked in crisis, now echoed as a chorus of resistance when Henry Bolingbroke seized the crown in 1598. Becoming King Henry IV, he justified his actions with appeals to the law and the people's will. His claim wasn't based solely on blood, but on the idea that Richard II had broken the sacred compact between ruler and realm. Henry leaned heavily on the Magna Carta to support his rule. He swore public oaths to uphold its principles. By positioning himself as a defender of lawful monarchy, he set a precedent for constitutional kingship, even if his actual rule was often authoritarian. Rebellions soon followed, especially from supporters of the deposed Richard, but Henry invoked the Charter to justify suppressing them. While the Magna Carta protected against tyranny, it was also used by kings to portray themselves as lawful, even when wielding an iron fist. Nonetheless, his reign marked a subtle shift. Kings were no longer unquestioned rulers by divine right. They were expected to serve the law and the realm. Magna Carta was now a necessary political tool, invoked, displayed, and defended. Even when misused, it was a sign that the ideal of accountable kingship had become entrenched. Parliament played a larger role than ever before. Though often manipulated, it was summoned by both sides to grant legitimacy, raise taxes, and draft grievances. The idea that kings ruled with consent, once revolutionary, was now common rhetoric, still the bloodshed drowned out principle. Battles at Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury left thousands dead. Kings were made and unmade on the battlefield, not in council halls. But even in this darkness, the idea of legal kingship survived. Magna Carta's flame flickered, but did not die. It waited for a time when peace would return, and law could rise again. Though wary of baronial power, Henry VII confirmed the Magna Carta. He understood that the people craved stability and lawful rule. After years of chaos, he summoned Parliament regularly, but tightly controlled its agenda. The Magna Carta became less of a practical guide and more of a ceremonial symbol. It was referenced in coronations and legal rituals, but rarely used to challenge authority. Henry used law courts to consolidate control, creating institutions like the Star Chamber to suppress dissent. Yet the mere existence of the Magna Carta reminded the king that his power was conditional. It was a legacy he couldn't ignore. England was at peace, but beneath the surface, the question remained, how far could the crown go before the people pushed back? The Charter watched silently. By the dawn of the Shulock century, England had changed. Kings ruled more absolutely, courts were more centralized, and society was more ordered. Yet the Magna Carta remained quiet, revered, and untouched. It had become a foundational myth, like the crown itself. Though no longer a practical limit on kingship, its symbolic power endured. Monarchs confirmed it out of tradition. Lawyers cited it to uphold the principle that rulers were bound by law. It was engraved in the national imagination, a parchment that whispered of liberty, restraint, and justice. In a future not far off, kings would again stretch their powers. Parliaments would rise in resistance. And in every great English constitutional conflict, whether under the Tudors, Stuarts, or Victorians, those ancient words from Iten Urbak Ishuwu would rise again. No free man shall be imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his peers. Magna Carta was more than law. It was a promise, and it would not be forgotten. Henry VIII's reign, Ichen Wubait Lingzhou to Ichen Wubait Sisachi, marked a radical transformation in English monarchy. Bold, charismatic, and authoritarian, Henry expanded the crown's power beyond any medieval precedent. His most controversial act was breaking from the Roman Catholic Church in Ichen Wubait Censorsan, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. This religious revolution redefined the relationship between king and law. Parliament was used not to limit power, but to affirm it, passing the Act of Supremacy and allowing Henry to dissolve monasteries and confiscate church lands. The Magna Carta, with its protections for the church and calls for justice, was largely ignored. Yet even Henry felt the need to wrap his authority in legality. He maintained the outward form of law, using Parliament to legitimize sweeping decrees. Though he ruled imperiously, the tradition of the Magna Carta reminded many that there had once been limits to power. Some subjects quietly questioned his excesses. A few brave voices, like Sir Thomas More, invoked the idea that even kings must serve a higher law. But such resistance was fatal. The Magna Carta during Henry's reign was no sword, only a shadow. But shadows can grow, and in generations to come they would take shape again. Nifuris Speter. When Henry VIII died in Ichen Wubait Sisachi, his 9-year-old son Edward VI inherited the throne. The kingdom was now Protestant in law, but still deeply unstable. The real power lay with the regents, first Edward Seymour, then John Dudley, who used Edward's name to push radical religious reforms. The old structures of medieval monarchy were being rewritten. Royal authority reached further into religious practice, education, and civic life than ever before. Magna Carta was seldom invoked in these debates. It was seen as part of a bygone Catholic age. Still, in the courts and among reformers, whispers of liberty and restraint persisted. Protestant thinkers began looking to ancient laws and English tradition as justifications for resisting tyranny, especially against perceived popery or centralized abuses. The Magna Carta slowly began to find a new audience, not barons, but pamphleteers, lawyers, and scholars searching for the roots of English liberty. Though Edward's reign was short, his era laid the ideological groundwork for future conflicts, where the Charter's legacy would return in force. In silence, the Magna Carta waited, dormant, not dead. In this atmosphere of fear and fanaticism, the Magna Carta held little sway. Mary governed through religious mandate, not through consent or balance. Yet even in the midst of repression, legal minds began to reassert the idea that kings and queens should govern by law. Opposition to Mary grew quietly, but steadily. The Magna Carta, still taught in schools and referenced in legal commentaries, became a touchstone for those hoping to resist absolutism and foreign influence. Her reign lasted only 5 years, but the memory of terror and the flame of liberty that endured would shape her successor's approach to power. Elizabeth I came to power in 1848, inheriting a fractured kingdom, scarred by religious extremism. Pragmatic and politically astute, she sought to unify England under a middle way. The Elizabethan religious settlement carefully balanced Catholic tradition with Protestant doctrine, diffusing tensions, at least for a time. Elizabeth ruled with immense skill. She respected Parliament enough to keep it loyal, but never let it dominate her. She used law to legitimize her power, frequently referencing ancient customs and the Magna Carta when it suited her agenda. Unlike her siblings, Elizabeth saw value in symbolic tradition. Magna Carta was read aloud at ceremonies and cited in legal speeches. The Queen projected herself as a just ruler, chosen by God but bound by law and conscience. Still, she resisted challenges to her authority. When Parliament tried to push reforms too far, she reasserted her royal prerogative. The Magna Carta remained a respected relic, but its use was strategic, not foundational. Yet during her reign, a new generation of thinkers and writers began treating it not just as a baronial document, but as the seat of constitutional monarchy. Elizabeth died childless in Ling-San. Her cousin, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England, ushering in the Stuart dynasty. Educated, eloquent, and deeply committed to the divine right of kings, James clashed immediately with a parliament accustomed to the delicate balance of the Tudor era. He believed the monarch answered only to God, not Parliament, not the law, not even the Magna Carta. He famously dismissed it as a relic, claiming the king was the father of the people and thus above limitation. Yet Parliament resisted. Members invoked the Magna Carta to challenge royal overreach. Sir Edward Coke, a leading legal mind, argued passionately that even kings were subject to common law. The Charter was no longer a dusty manuscript. It was becoming a constitutional weapon. When Charles I came to the throne in 1848, he inherited his father James I's belief in the divine right of kings. But unlike James, Charles lacked the tact and patience to negotiate with Parliament. He levied taxes without consent, imprisoned nobles without trial, and imposed forced loans, all in open defiance of centuries of precedent. Parliament responded with outrage. In 1848, they drafted the Petition of Right, a powerful reaffirmation of Magna Carta's principles. It declared that the king could not tax without consent, imprison without cause, or billet troops in private homes. Charles signed it, grudgingly, yet within a year he dissolved Parliament and ruled alone for 11 years. It was tyranny cloaked in divine justification. Bruges. The battle lines were clear: kingly absolutism versus the ancient rights of the realm. The bloodshed would be immense, but the idea that even kings must obey the law would soon face its most dramatic trial. The war devastated the countryside and split families. Parliament's army, led by the disciplined Oliver Cromwell, eventually triumphed. In a shocking turn, Charles was captured, tried for treason, and, most astonishingly, executed in Unchecked for the first time in English history. A reigning monarch was held accountable by law. Parliament declared that no person, even the king, was above judgment. Though controversial and unprecedented, the trial was framed around the very ideals seeded at Runnymede centuries earlier. The Magna Carta was cited at trial. The spirit of Arbitration echoed in the courtroom. Due process, lawful authority, and accountability. England became a republic, briefly known as the Commonwealth. Monarchy was abolished. Power had passed to Parliament, though Cromwell's regime would become authoritarian in its own way. The execution of Charles I marked a seismic shift in world history. The Magna Carta had survived the Age of Kings, and it had just brought one to judgment in Liberties. After years of republican rule, monarchy was restored. Charles II, son of the executed king, returned from exile to reclaim the throne. But the England he inherited had changed forever. Though Charles II held real power, he could not rule as his father did. Parliament had tasted sovereignty. The public had seen what unchecked monarchy could lead to. And the Magna Carta, once a dusty relic, was now enshrined in national memory. During the Restoration, the Magna Carta was republished widely. Scholars printed annotated copies. It became a teaching tool in universities and a symbol of British liberty. 2. Even though the monarch was back, the idea of limited government had taken deep root. The Unchecked Habeas Corpus Act, which guaranteed protection from unlawful imprisonment, was a direct descendant of Magna Carta's principles. It formalized the right to due process and became one of the most celebrated laws in English history. The Restoration was not just a return, it was a reconciliation between king and law, between tradition and reform. The Magna Carta had proven it could survive revolution and revival. In Unchecked, England once again faced crisis. King James II, a Catholic, sought to rule without Parliament and suspended laws at will. Fearful of tyranny and religious absolutism, Parliament invited William of Orange and his wife Mary to assume the throne. What followed was the Glorious Revolution, a bloodless coup that removed James II and installed constitutional monarchy. In Unchecked, the new rulers signed the English Bill of Rights, a landmark document that codified limits on royal power, guaranteed free elections, and affirmed many principles found in the Magna Carta. The Bill of Rights stated that laws could not be suspended by the monarch, and that taxation required parliamentary approval. It also guaranteed the right to petition and banned cruel and unusual punishment. Magna Carta's ancient ideals had found a new form, expanded, modernized, and enshrined. England had entered the age of constitutional monarchy. The king or queen now ruled by consent of the governed, and behind this transformation stood the legacy of Runnymede, glowing brighter than ever before. Centuries after its creation, the Magna Carta continues to shape the world. Its principles, Liberty, accountability, due process have inspired constitutions, revolutions, and movements across the globe. In the shoebath century, the American colonists cited the Magna Carta when demanding independence from Britain. No taxation without representation. Echoing the barons of Itenarbaki-Shawu, the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights carry its spirit. Later, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and countless national charters drew on its legacy. In modern Britain, Magna Carta remains a revered icon. Though many of its original clauses have been repealed, its impact survives in trial by jury, habeas corpus, and the rule of law. Displayed in museums, studied in schools, and quoted by statesmen, Magna Carta lives on, not as a static document, but as a living symbol of freedom. From the fields of Runnymede to courtrooms and parliaments around the world, its message endures, surgit. No one is above the law,